by Martin, I don't know what to call you, Martin Unidentified Willis.
Well, yes, only because I forgot my license. How did you know that? I'm driving without a license.
Wow. That fits. It just came out, and then it actually applied to the situation.
I know. I left my wallet at home by accident this morning. So that was, I think you're doing like this telepathy thing or something. I don't know what's going on. Wow.
The world's a strange place the last few days. I think everybody would agree with that.
I think so.
Especially with all this news and everything going on. You still okay?
I agree. I think you're right. It's really been something, hasn't it?
Yeah. So let's talk about that something, and this show is something. So I called it a special report. Some of you may be expecting, because that is, I'm having Leslie Kane on today. You're wrong, and I'm so sorry, and so is Leslie. She was not able to make it, and so, which is kind of a bummer. Of course, she's really busy. She's been out there, but the holidays and a bunch of other stuff came up, and she had to cancel. She's devastated. However, she has promised me, and I apologize, Martin, but she has promised me that I will be the first interview she does when she gets back into, having some time. So she'll be doing an interview with us in the next couple of weeks. So that'll be good, because news keeps developing. In fact, she was very concerned. She was like, hey, if we do an interview, you can't post it like a couple days later, because there's so much that's excuse me, there's so much that's changing.
That's right.
Day by day. So at least we'll have the latest when that happens. However, I have the next best thing. There would be better. Better would be maybe Lou Elizondo, the man of the hour right now, but it's not him. But I do have John Alexander and Nick Pope. Why is that important? Yeah, pretty cool. Because John Alexander was in Army intelligence, just like a lot of these people in the To the Stars Academy, which I'll refer to as TTSA going forward, that group that Tom put together. A lot of those guys were in defense and intelligence. And Lou Elizondo, who ran this Department of Defense program, he also was in defense intelligence. So John Alexander comes from that world. Not only that, when he was in intelligence, and this was a couple decades ago, this is before this DoD UFO program, he and some buddies got together to find who are these people keeping the UFO secrets. They did a deep dig to figure out, is there a secret organization out there that is investigating UFOs and keeping the secrets? Some of them assumed there were, but John says he didn't find any. What he found was disappointing, was kind of bumbling by the Air Force. They're just kind of like, UFOs are a hot potato. I don't want to deal with it. You deal with it type of situation.
Wow. Yeah, I remember, he did that project where he was trying to find out. And I understand the hot potato, and it's kind of how this whole thing kind of developed very quietly. And it's quite fascinating how all this took place.
And we talk about this, kind of this embarrassment factor that happens. The other person I have is Nick Pope. Nick Pope I've had on several times, but the reason he's important is because he worked at the UFO desk for the MOD, the Ministry of Defense in the UK. So essentially, Nick Pope's job there in the 90s was similar to Lou Elizondo's job in many ways. And so we'll talk about that. So it's kind of a roundtable. Got them both on at the same time. And we do this roundtable discussion about all this recent news. So very, very exciting stuff. I mean, these guys they talk about having some internal insight. I think it doesn't get better than these two guys.
I can't wait to listen to the show.
Mm-hmm. So it's a lot of fun. So there's a lot of news, of course, around this DoD program, and, since we've talked last, Martin, there's been more news because there's stories coming out every day. There's a story that came out today in The Sun, actually, that has my face on the front, which is a little bit embarrassing, with Tom DeLonge. Because, I'm not the story, but they liked, I'm pretty much the only one talking about Tom DeLonge, probably because it seems like he's taken a back seat a bit. And I did write a piece on the Huffington Post and at openminds.tv, a longer piece about Tom's involvement with this whole thing, but and the fact that I feel if it wasn't for him, it wouldn't have happened. This revelation. So that's been going on. But what have you been observing? Let's talk some of the news out there.
Well, also, I do want to say, when you were with me on my show the other night with Kevin Randall, what did you think about, I loved his comment. He says, I guess I owe Tom DeLonge an apology, he said.
You know what is funny is after I wrote my piece about Tom DeLonge and his involvement, I got a few responses like that saying, you're right, he deserves credit. We need to give credit where credit's due. And I lay it out. How on the one hand Tom is saying some pretty wild stuff, and on the other hand what he delivered was quite remarkable and credible. This revelation that the government's been secretly investigating UFOs and have discovered unknowns, and we haven't been told that for decades, literally decades. And not only that, lots of us have been banging our head against the wall saying, hey, look, the government is investigating UFOs. We've got these files, even though they say they're not. And everybody ignores us. They think we're conspiracy goofballs or something. So, this vindicates us and demonstrates that we were right all along, that there was something going on. So, and we wouldn't have had that without Tom. So that's a really big deal. So you can hear with Kevin Randall, because Kevin Randall's one of these guys who's been very careful researcher, great researcher. And I asked that of John and Nick, not about Tom specifically, but how important this news is. And we'll talk about that. But it is very important news, and we wouldn't have it without Tom. So a lot of people are feeling that way. So I hope people read my story. And I understand, I think some were disappointed because Tom, has these pretty wild ideas, and that his ideas are not what he proved or demonstrated. But what he demonstrated is something that I would have hoped he would demonstrate, which is more exciting. Just this simple revelation that they are investigating and taking it seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. So getting back to what is going on with the news, I just wanted to comment because the other night, not last night, but the night before, I turned on CNN News because they've been covering this pretty steady around 10 o'clock. And all of a sudden, the host said, my next guest is Neil deGrasse Tyson. And so I went, oh no, because I have watched him, over the years, bash the whole UFO thing, many times. And so I just thought that was going to be more of that. And I was totally impressed with the way he handled it this time. So I really enjoyed what he said. He was actually almost arguing with the host of the show, saying, no, I really think it's not a bad idea that these things are investigated. And it's like, wow, that was Neil deGrasse Tyson saying that. And he's saying, it is, he did remind everyone, and I think it's a good point, is that a UFO means an unidentified flying object. He said perhaps an astrophysicist like myself and others may be able to make it an IFO, an identified object. But, I don't know about this one in particular, that type of thing. So it was great to hear someone who usually, like I said, he usually bashes the UFO idea. In the past, that's what I've seen repeatedly. So I was really relieved that he actually was acting like this is a serious thing that, could possibly be looked at.
I agree with you. I heard that interview, and I also was impressed. He was making the point, and I understand his point that, when Elizondo says this is evidence of life elsewhere, or something like that. Or he said, I think this is evidence that we're not alone, compelling evidence that we're not alone, and I'll leave it at that. Tyson disagreed with that. He said, this isn't evidence of that. This is evidence of unknowns. And to Elizondo's defense, it was Aaron Burnett on CNN who pushed Elizondo to that answer, because she kept asking him about aliens, and he said, this isn't about that. I don't want to talk about that. This isn't about that. And he finally gave her that little thing. And, of course, that's the thing they run with, which is really frustrating. I watched an interview with James Fox on CNN, and they kept doing that. Her sentence, her question started with asking about UFOs, but in the same question incorporated aliens. And I think what people have to do is kind of say, hey, look, you're asking me two different questions here. You're asking me about UFOs, investigating unidentified objects. Then you're asking me to speculate about aliens. This isn't about aliens. This is about UFOs and gathering data to figure out what they are. We don't know what they are. Is it possible they're extraterrestrial? Perhaps that may be the case, but we have to follow the data to bring us to that conclusion, and we just don't have those conclusions yet. So, but I was really impressed with Tyson, too, because he was very supportive of the program. Like you said, he said $22 million is a drop in the bucket. He said it's like
true,
0.00000 something percent of the defense budget. It's totally justified to spend a little bit of money in relative terms, of course, on investigating unknown objects these guys are observing. It makes sense to do that. And I thought that was really cool, too.
Yeah. And to your point, I have watched these people, that are conducting the interview just push someone into a corner. They, the same person did that with Leslie Kane the other night, and she held her ground pretty well. But trying to get them into saying it's extraterrestrial, they're just, it's like a loaded question after a loaded question, trying to get them to say that. I like the fact that at least no one is going there. I just hope no one goes there, because I think it would just take away from it if someone said, yes, I do believe they're extraterrestrial.
Yeah, and I think that's why, normally we've heard Tom DeLonge be the front guy out there speaking like crazy to everybody and talking about the alien topic, and I think that's why he must have agreed to kind of sit on the sidelines for now and chill out, and let these guys have their moment to talk about the actual investigation. And this is partially us educating the mainstream, though, too. So it's kind of educating them and trying to detach the alien stigma from the term UFO, because we've tried to come up with these terms, UAP, anomalous aerial phenomena. It doesn't work. That has not worked with the press. They don't say, oh, okay, you've got a UAP. That's totally different than a UFO. No, they say UFO. They go back to the term UFO because really that's just trying to sneakily say the same thing using a different term. So you have to tackle the idea of UFO that they have in their mind and detach that stigma. And that's what we've got to work towards. And I think is happening. But we have to be a little more aggressive. And we shouldn't be aggressive or be afraid to be aggressive. Leslie shouldn't be afraid to say, hey, she was with Don Lemon. Hey, Don, this isn't aliens. I know that's really interesting to talk about, but that's not what we're talking about. What we need to focus on and what the issue here is, and what the DoD was doing was examining unknown objects, unknown aircraft, and they were observing aircraft that demonstrated technologies that are beyond our own. That is the issue. We need to continue to investigate that, and then maybe we'll be able to have some answers as to what is the root of this issue. But that needs to be the focus.
Right. And I do understand when, like Don or anyone else is, interviewing someone, they're going to ask, well, what do you think it is? I mean, that's a normal question for anyone to ask, because, for instance, when the Navy pilot, David, I can't remember, it's Farrell or something like that, was being interviewed, he was talking about what he observed. Well, this thing went that way, it went this way. It didn't have any source of propulsion that was visual or any, wings or anything like that. So when you tell a story like that, of course, the next question is going to be, well, what do you think it was? So I do understand, but all you can answer if you're being interviewed is, I'm not sure. What else can you say? If we're at a point where we have to be careful, anyone that's being interviewed, because it can go, it can go south pretty quickly.
Right. And, when Lou was being pushed, and I don't understand necessarily why they do this, but he could have said, and I think it would have been accurate and just fine to say, I don't know. Which is like, are these aliens? I don't know. That's the point. We don't know. We need to do the investigation to determine what the matter is. And that once that point is made, then maybe some speculation could happen. Because if, of course, a thorough study of UFOs is able to determine or demonstrate with some, demonstrate that we are having visitations, like Bigelow seems to be convinced of as well, then that's extraordinary. That is really cool. That would be interesting if that were the case. Another interesting point too is this kind of cat and mouse game thing that happens is that, throughout the years, even in Project Blue Book, we got a lot of files that are very similar to the one case they've released details to, and that these jet fighter pilots are coming out and talking about, which is, essentially the Nimitz carrier group saw this object they called a Tic Tac. It was a 40-foot long object that was hovering and then making weird maneuvers and shooting off at incredible speed, that when jets are scrambled to the area of an unknown, that the unknown's observed for a short period of time and then races off at incredible speed. That is what we've heard over and over and over and over again.
Yes.
Which would kind of be indicative of, I think, what Nick Pope suggested on an article recently, which is that perhaps these are observation, these things are here for observation only type of thing. That's an interesting idea.
Yeah, like drones in a way.
Yeah, interstellar drones. Sure.
I mean, I know we can't fathom something like that because of the distance thing, but I don't think that's a bad theory at all.
Mm-hmm. Is there another? Go ahead.
No, I'm just saying. We would do it if we could.
Mm-hmm. Is there another interesting story out there?
No, but well, I'm sure there is. But to your point, also, I just want to say this. I think it would be great if people are being interviewed about this, is if they brought up that topic, that these things have been observed for a long time. It's not just recently. Because I think a lot of people may just assume that, wow, this happened, and then not really know anything else about it. But I really think that more people would be interested in finding out if they knew, well, this has been happening for decades, so it can't be some new technology.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a big point I'm trying to make to some of the people in the press who have contacted me lately, is that this is important because of the reason that we said earlier, that the government has been denying any research into this topic, or that they take it seriously when actually they do. Another point is that exactly what you said, that this is not a new occurrence, that these sort of events have happened over and over again. And the third point that I like to make with them is that things have changed a bit, in that now, I guess getting back to Robert Powell and his investigation, how he looked into this case, this Nimitz case, for the last year or so, and when he had put in FOIA requests, they said they didn't have any information. And now that this story has come out, he's revisited with them, and they said, we will now have information forthcoming. So essentially,
really?
acknowledging that they lied in the first case, that they didn't have information, and that now, because they're kind of busted, they're going to be revealing, at least providing something to people. And I'm sure when they provide this information, it won't just go to Robert Powell. I'm sure the New York Times and others have made these similar requests. So it's at least opened up this case a little bit.
Now, do you think, someone asked me the other day, and I thought it was a fairly decent question, do you think this is a baby step on disclosure?
Well,
and what are your thoughts about that?
I don't think so. At least I don't know for sure, but I don't think so. I mean, it could be argued that this is disclosure. They did disclose that they're investigating UFOs, and they have been doing that secretly. That's a disclosure, and it could be the disclosure. The issue is, will we have another level of disclosure? Elizondo says he is not aware of anybody else looking into this matter, and that no one else had looked into the matter. In fact, the exotic materials they obtained, that they claim to have obtained, are in Bigelow's hands. They contracted Bigelow to Aerospace to look at this. So that, to me, would indicate there is no bigger program. If there was a bigger program, why would they give that material to Bigelow instead of shuttling that to whatever this other secret program is?
Right, unless it's always been in a subcontractor's hands, in a private's hands to begin with. There's always been argument about that. Well, that's the way you keep a secret, is to get it out of, government.
Yeah, and one of the points that John's going to make here in a little bit in the interview is that there's no real leadership, that it's very haphazard. And we've had these issues in the past, that each branch of the military works on their own projects and on their own things, and they work with their own contractors. So, in other words, there could be a program that the Navy has that the Air Force is not aware of, sort of thing. So we heard of a Department of Defense, which makes sense because that's more centralized, but perhaps there is another program out there that we're just not aware of, and they're not aware of, and they're not even working together. That would be possible, but I don't know. Well, obviously, it seems that that's what Tom DeLonge thinks, that that there will be some sort of revelation that they've retrieved a body, that they do know that aliens exist. There's no proof or indication, official indication of that at all at this time. So I don't know.
It also goes along the line with what I've said on my show a number of times, that my thoughts are, and this is just a theory, that the government has no idea what's going on. And they're just where we are at, looking at this. Maybe they would have some more insight.
Yeah,
because there's a lot of classified information.
We're almost out of time, but to your point, okay. Because we keep hearing that over and over again. Now there's another secret project that came out, but the whole thing is we don't know much, and and that's what Alexander is saying. They don't know much, and they're just as mystified as this by all of this as the rest of us, and that's all the indication we have. But thank you so much for joining us, Martin. Absolutely, my pleasure. For those of you who celebrate Christmas, I hope you have a wonderful and safe Christmas. All right, so we've got to go to break, and now for those of you listening on KGRA, you'll hear a couple commercials, and then for those of you listening on the podcast, you'll hear a short music interlude, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Open Mind UFO Radio for this special edition show just prior to the holidays. Santa Claus is getting his sled ready right now, and all of us, of course, are talking UFOs. And we've got a bigger audience talking UFOs than normal out there in the world. Hopefully Santa doesn't get buzzed by any unknown object, but On the phone with me is John Alexander and Nick Pope, and I don't think I could have got two better people because John Alexander worked in Army intelligence, and many of the To the Stars Academy people worked in intelligence, including the man of the hour, Lou Elizondo, who we'll be talking about, and then also Nick Pope. And speaking of Lou, Nick Pope did kind of what Lou did for the UK, working at the Ministry of Defense for a few years. So we'll get into that as well. So welcome, gentlemen.
Glad to be here.
All right.
Yes, likewise. Good to be joining you for this show.
So to start off, John, so this is kind of like, I guess, is it this a big surprise, this revelation that this department exists, especially given that when you were in Army intelligence, you kind of got some buddies together to look for any clandestine kind of UFO project in the government?
Well, we did, but we went much further than that. And I think this is, it can actually be explained. I was not familiar with it. They came along 2 decades after I retired. But what you're seeing here is actually a relatively small program, and I think it's personality dependent, meaning you had to have somebody like Lou who going to pick up the guidon and cause it to happen. I've got to say he did better than I did because we were not able to get funding, and I would say that the reasons we were not are the ones that have been exposed in the heat that people are taking now. We can cover more about that if you wish.
Yeah, we'll get into that, definitely. But I want to ask Nick, I mean, you had mentioned, John, you just mentioned that, you know, it was kind of a one guy, they didn't have a lot of resources, which is kind of like your program, Nick. Wasn't it just maybe, were you the only staffer at the UFO desk and then you worked with other agencies?
Yes, it was pretty much just myself as the subject matter expert. I had administrative support, and of course there was a whole network of other experts that we could bring in on particular investigations, be they radar experts, be they imagery analysts. So we had a wide reach, but yeah, the actual core team was very small. And one reason for that goes back to this point about the political embarrassment. We did not want this to be a particularly visible program, and we didn't want there to be much of a cost associated with it. And it depends how you do the accounting. Now, I've had a financial policy job at the Ministry of Defense, and I know that as long as you use existing resources concurrently with other defense tasks, you can really say that there's no additional cash cost in what you're doing. And that's one way to keep things off the radar, pun intended.
So this budget...
Can I mention here, what Nick's just mentioned is absolutely critical. And the reason, I think, for the end of the program, and that is when you say off the radar, there's external radars and internal radars. And as long as you do things at a certain level, you can stay, below the radar, if you use that euphemism, meaning you're not drawing attention to yourself. And I've got to agree with Nick. We found the same thing. People were scared to death of being exposed and thought to be wasting resources. That was a critical issue.
Right. And then this budget. So it kind of gets back to this $22 million budget that they had, or at least, and maybe you guys can clarify, it's a little unclear. Is that money that all went to Bigelow or not? I think Chris Mellon made a comment on Coast to Coast when he was on with George Knapp and I, that they probably didn't see all of that money, even though it was earmarked for the program. And is that a lot of money when it comes to this sort of program?
It's minuscule. One of my pet sayings, you'll see it repeatedly, is whatever we're looking at is at least as complex as AIDS or cancer. And remember, when you say 22 million, you're talking over 5 years. So the amount of money, I actually did the calculations last night, and based on the budget, you're talking about 0.001% of the defense budget.
I mean,
yes. Mm-hmm. Let me just to maybe give people an example of what that might buy. I think it buys you about a quarter of one of the new F-35 fighters.
Right. And how does that compare to the budget, for your program?
Well,
Nick?
We hardly ever costed it out. That's the thing. In terms of additional cash costs, we were desperate to keep those almost down to zero. Hence, as I say, this idea of simply piggybacking on other resources and capabilities that already existed within the Ministry of Defense.
Mm-hmm. And so since 2012, when the Pentagon says they ended that budget, it seems like that's what this organization was doing. They were using other resources.
Yes, I think certainly what I've heard, and I hasten to add, I have not got any inside knowledge about this particular U.S. program. I had left even the Ministry of Defense in the UK by the time this was set up, and it's not clear, though perhaps we can get into that later, the extent to which there was any liaison with allies. But my understanding is that, yes, it continues in some form, but now kind of off the books, unofficially, just piggybacking, as I say, on existing resources and capabilities. So almost back to this idea of people looking at this unofficially, just in the margins of looking at other things like Russian aerospace capability.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think you've hit on some critical issues here, and I think one of the issues, they have not played it very well politically since it came out. Because I think the public now believes there was a big UFO program, when in fact, A, small, B, they were looking at specific kinds of threats. And I think probably, given the advent of drones and things, other kinds of emerging threats as well. But I offer to people, if you think there's a program, try calling your local government agency, Air Force, or whatever, and try to report a UFO, and you're going to find they don't take it. And what I've heard from the people involved is, I think most, if not all, of these things had to do with incidents that involved our military assets, as opposed to just general comments about seeing weird stuff.
I think you're right. And I think that either Chris Mellon or maybe Luis Elizondo has confirmed that in one of their more recent interviews, that these were military cases that they were looking at. Because ridiculously, I remember my first UFO investigation from MUFON, and it was this security guard who had just come back from Desert Storm, and he saw some weird thing. It was over a period of time over a mountain in Colorado where there's a lot of air traffic just in the suburbs there. And finally he said, I better call this in. He said he was still kind of hyped up. He was still like on alert, looking for abnormal things, and they're supposed to report that sort of thing. And so he tried calling the airport, the FAA. Nobody wanted to hear anything. And then I did the same to see if, anything else was reported. And shockingly, that's when I found out they don't want to hear anything about it. The FAA didn't want to hear about an object in our airspace. They told him and me to call Davenport, Peter Davenport, his New Fork organization. And I don't know that Davenport, one guy, sitting at his computer in Washington, would have been able to do anything about this apparent threat. That was,
No, well, that's the problem. You're back. Sorry, go on, John.
No, I was going to say that has been the case across the board. You might remember when I was with NIDS, We did visit the FAA. I took Bob Bigelow down there. And it turned out that the Deputy Director of Security had been a personal friend of mine, who, frankly, when I brought up UFOs, went, yeah, Alexander's crazy again. But he did put us in touch, and it was very interesting what happened. We dealt with some very high-level people. They had no problem in believing in UFOs, and some of them who had been air traffic controllers said, yeah, they had such reports and were themselves aware of it, but did not want to actively get involved. I mean, they were looking, and for a while, NIDS was, listed as a place to call because, like I say, government didn't want involvement, and they just wanted to make this go away as quickly as possible without alienating the public.
Mm-hmm. And Nick, what were you going to say?
I was going to say it comes back to this age-old point about the language that one uses when discussing this subject. And I'm talking about when those of us actually within government do this sort of thing. You really can't ever run a UFO project. We, in the Ministry of Defense, changed the terminology, as you know, to UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, in an attempt to lose the pop culture baggage that the term UFO has, and in an attempt that was ultimately successful to get some funding for a small intelligence assessment that we codenamed Project Condign. But really, you have to kind of almost reinvent the language on this. Hence, we get into advanced aerospace threat identification programs. We get into advanced theoretical physics groups. We get into all of this, and it's just a way around it. If a pilot says, I want to report a UFO, they might actually get a psychological evaluation and get grounded. So the only way around it is to say, I think I've seen one of these new drones, and I'm a little concerned that it's flying in restricted airspace. Then you might get someone in government to take a look at it.
Yeah, no, Nick is exactly right on this, and that's what we did. We created the term advanced theoretical physics, and the reason for that was to prevent, we think, people from filing Freedom of Information reports thinking they would ask for UFOs and there would not be any translation. So Nick is exactly right, and the linguistics is very important.
Mm-hmm. Now, getting back to another matter that you had mentioned, you both had talked about, is kind of like why something like this needs to be so secret. And Esquire actually had a story that came out today, and it was from a military historian and former strategist, Robert Bateman. And he talked about this. He was like, why is the government so cagey on UFO matters? And he said, essentially, these special access programs, the type that was created in the DoD here, they are even more secret than top secret because they vet and they're even more careful about who knows what. And there's two reasons. Either because we want to hide capabilities from the Chinese or the Russians or enemies, or the second reason is because it's kind of politically embarrassing. So, for instance, you talked about, when they've done, researched what games Chinese children play so that they have an idea of their psychology, and that this is that sort of thing. It's a politically embarrassing sort of thing, and it's one of the reasons that answers the major secrecy, even though it doesn't seem like, it's not like they were hiding any dead alien bodies or something like that.
Well, the black world is replete with those things, not just in UFOs, but in other areas where they want to hide stuff because of potential for embarrassment. Unfortunately, I think the people who divine this are not aware of what the public believes. I remember, about 70% of the public believes they've actually seen a UFO, and there's actually considerable support. Having said that, if you looked at the ones I saw on CNN and I guess NBC reports coming out, they brought out what I call the ain't it awful crowd. Look at the waste of government money. And that is internally what they did run into, by the way. That all indications are that was a piece of it, saying you're wasting your money. Remember, I've always said that there is competition for this money, even in the black world. As long as you're low enough, it won't cause a flap. But as it becomes visible, and this also happened, I might mention, with the remote viewing program, some of the things that led to the death of that. And it had to do with the waste of money aspect, which you can make.
Mm-hmm. Nick's ran into that.
Yes. Let me actually pick up on a couple of those points, and then perhaps get into another interesting thing. One reason for the secrecy is certainly the political embarrassment, though another reason is that actually the sorts of resources that you would need to access to properly investigate the most credible sightings do include some fairly sensitive pieces of kit and capabilities. I'm talking about things such as the space tracking radars that form part of the ballistic missile early warning system, possibly the deep space network, various other things. So there are quite a lot of reasons why this might be classified. Not all of it is political embarrassment, though part of it is. I don't think we should also... one more point on this. I don't think we should also underestimate the whole technology acquisition aspect of this. You know, we should take a step back with this and say, why are governments looking at this? Why are, people like John and myself interested in this anyway? And one of the answers is, well, because there does look as if there's a capability out there that we don't have, a technology. And in one sense, we don't actually go in with a conclusion-led belief system of what we're dealing with. In one sense, we go in, look, doesn't matter if it's Russian or Martian, if it can do those speeds and maneuvers, there's a technology there that we want because it seems to be better than ours. And that's why, by the way, the word threat tends to crop up in all these organizations. Advanced Aerospace Threat Investigation Program. We are interested, quite rightly, in potential threats. And let's make no mistake about it. If this technology truly did come from some exotic source, the nation or corporation that first acquires it is going to have a pretty huge advantage.
Which is what it seems... Bigelow has talked about that one of his main goals and John, you would know about this because you worked with Bigelow on some of these projects. With Bigelow Aerospace was tech acquisition. He was planning on getting into before he got into the commercial space industry. He was doing these sort of things, looking for technology to acquire, hopefully being able to glean some technology from the observed phenomena of UFOs that he could develop for his company. So he was looking for that himself, it seems.
Well, in years past, long before I was at Bigelow, and part of our study, we had a guy by the name of Ben Rich, and Ben was the head of the Skunk Works, and despite a lot of stories out there, I don't believe that they had it, but I had talked to him about this specifically on several occasions and somewhat in depth, and he had a shopping list, so it was exactly that. I mean, he wanted the propulsion system, and give me this and give me that, because he recognized the technological advantage that they could gain by having it.
Right. So, To the Stars Academy, when they announced their launch, they also said something similar, that they're hoping to glean the technology, and even they seem to have, and you guys know, how put of. I'm not sure if either of you are familiar with Steve Justice, a guy who worked for Skunk Works, who's now working with this To the Stars Academy team. They seem to even think that they have been able to observe a technology that they want to develop, and they kind of have an idea of a craft. They've even released a picture of a craft that they hope to develop.
Well, when I had developed this study, again, we're talking in 1980s, one of the things that we were proposing to folks was to do exactly that if you looked at these observations carefully and tried to discern what the characteristics were, that you could back your way into, what kind of technology would be required to enable that. And we do know, and this is kind of across the board, not just in this area, but being able to envision the outcome that you want is very important to leading to development of new technology.
That's interesting. Did you have a comment that way, Nick? I mean, was there any technology that was able to be acquired, do you believe, from the UFO desk in the MOD?
Not to my knowledge, but that didn't mean that we didn't have the aspiration to acquire that technology. And I suspect that our shopping list was very similar, and I would say almost identical to the U.S. list. Of course, all the things that you'd want would be sort of exotic propulsion systems, avionics, aerodynamics, better stealth, that sort of thing. And let's not forget, of course, the weaponization of this. If you look at the declassified parts of the UK government intelligence assessment on this, Project Condign, you will see the phrase novel military applications used when talking about the aspirations of what we might get from a better understanding of UFOs, whatever they turn out to be. And you will specifically see, for example, reference to RF weapons, radio frequency weapons, directed energy weapons, whatever you want to talk, whatever terminology you want to use. Again, I go back to the fact we don't necessarily say that we think this is extraterrestrial. We simply say that technology seems to be out there and we would like to acquire it. And as I say, it goes back, the real, I think, reason for a lot of the secrecy is that the nation that first gets its hands on that has something that nobody else has. And one other point, by the way, and you can make a wider point about the extent to which, for example, the space program has been segueing out of government and into the private sector. One very important aspect of this whole story goes back to the involvement of Robert Bigelow, but it's a more general point.
I'm going to stop you there. Hold on to that point because we're out of time. So we'll get back to that after the break because I do want to address the whole Bigelow aspect of this as well. So we'll be right back with that. But you're listening to Open Minds UFO Radio. I'm here with John Alexander and Nick Pope. We're going to take a quick break. If you're listening on KGRA, you're going to hear some commercials. Otherwise, if you're listening to the podcast, you're just going to hear a short musical interlude. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll be right back. All right, we're back. You're listening to Open Minds UFO Radio. I'm your host, Alejandro Rojas, and we have Nick Pope, formerly working the UFO desk for the Ministry of Defense, and we've got John Alexander, former Army intelligence, but then he's worked in the defense industry in multiple different ways, and he still does some consulting. So, and he used to work with Bigelow. So earlier, John mentioned NIDS, which was the what was that acronym mean again? I forget.
The National Institute for Discovery Science. Right,
which was Bigelow's first organization to look into paranormal aspect of the different paranormal aspects. So
actually, the second, he's had a longer interest than that.
Wow, I was not aware of that, but we'll get into that. But Nick, you were making a point about Bigelow's involvement.
Yes, one of the critical points about the New York Times story about the Pentagon's UFO investigations is the fact that this was moved very quickly out of government into the private sector, into, of course, Bigelow Aerospace. But I've seen this before in some of my UK work in relation to Project Condign, as I mentioned, the intelligence study on UFOs, also a defense intelligence staff study into remote viewing. The move of this into the private sector was deliberate, and what it meant was that it was making parliamentary, or in your case, in the US, congressional scrutiny more difficult, and critically, it was taking it outside of the scope of the Freedom of Information Act. Now, what I see as I look at people discuss this latest story on the internet is everyone's saying, right, we're going to really hit them with all these Freedom of Information Act requests now, and we're going to get to the bottom of some of the other unanswered questions here. Well, good luck with that, but I think people are in for a bit of a disappointment. What you tend to get is you get the documents at the beginning of the program where government kind of sets it up and then moves it over into private sector. Then you get whatever reports get sent back into government, but everyone knows that they are subject to FOI. But what you don't get is all the stuff in the middle, because Freedom of Information Act, of course, doesn't apply to the private sector. And this, I'll choose my words carefully, but this is something that people in government know about, and I'm sure are rather pleased. I suspect it goes a little bit further than unintended consequences. And sometimes these things are done through new contracts, but very often I've seen it done in the UK with an amendment to an existing defense contract. And so very little of the good stuff is actually FOI-able.
John.
Well, what I want to follow up is a little different, and that has to do with whatever we're looking at and the capabilities. Because in my view, what we're looking at in these way of craft and doing highly maneuverable things is, in fact, a new source of energy. So this has geopolitical, strategic consequences. Because I've always said that little widgets flying around are interesting, but that is nothing compared to understanding of an energy that might take us away from the requirement for fossil fuels.
Mm-hmm. And you think then that is, as it pertains to this story, a justification for secrecy?
I don't think they're there yet. I'm just saying that in my view, is the real strategic issue. I might mention from secrecy, and I know that Lou and Chris and I have talked about it, and an area we agree with. Nick can talk to the UK, but we all, I think, believe that this has been terribly overclassified. Mm-hmm. And most of the information really does need to get much more into the public sector.
Mm-hmm. So, and
particularly in areas where we're looking at what we call basic science, and I think that's what needs, where the understanding needs to be. I think what you're alluding to, what Hal may have divined on it, I do think that they're still guessing a bit, but it's certainly worth exploration.
Mm-hmm. So I think I think I've talked to both of you on this before, but you both kind of describe is that then the military is kind of in this bind that the UFO phenomena is politically embarrassing, but at the same time, the potential payoff is huge. It's either developing these weapon systems and being the first to get there, or it is developing these energy systems, these power systems, which is also a huge payoff. So they have this huge reason to do it, but how to do it is a bit tricky.
Yes, if I might address a bit of that, we would, and I think the people listening to the program may agree with that, but that is not a universally held position. One of the big findings in the study that I ran was that nobody's in charge. And if you listen to Chris Mellon, who was in a position to oversee a lot of things, that's basically his position now. Nobody is in charge, at least not at a high enough level that can coordinate all of the activities that would be necessary for a fully integrated program. Rather, they were, and I do know that they were hit and miss as to how the information was derived and whether they ever even heard about it. So loss of command and control, and you do have a number of people internally who think it's all BS. You know, this is all a waste of time and energy. So you've got to be willing to accept, A, the reality of the phenomena, and B, take it the next step farther in understanding the implications, again, at a strategic geopolitical level before you're doing it. And I don't think there's a lot of people who are willing to make those leaps.
Nick?
Yes, that I think is something that certainly resonates with me. You know, I think here in the U.S., given this confusion we have over who's in charge, all the different agencies involved, the private sector involvement too, perhaps these new revelations can lead to a reassessment of this in government. Now, of course, I'm completely out of the game anyway, and the U.S. is not my area of expertise. But coming at this from my background, I can't help but think that here in the U.S., OSTP, you know, might be well placed to get a grip on this, and maybe Office of Science and Technology Policy, White House OSTP, and the director there kind of maybe, you know, bang a few heads together, sit around and say, look, what have we got here? Who has done what? How can we try and draw some of these threads together? And how can we decide, you know, what have we got here? What do we need to do, and who should be doing it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm certainly not optimistic. It's a good idea and what needs to be done, but I'm not optimistic in the current environment where you can't get them to even listen to climate science, if you will, where the evidence is already overwhelming and happening, and yet they fail to respond for political reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that I share your view that it's perhaps an optimistic thing. I mean, I think in the current administration, this can probably only happen top down, and I sincerely hope that President Trump will be listening to all this and, you know, thinking, my goodness, what a confused mess the U.S. government has gotten itself into with this difficult and controversial subject over the years. I want someone to sort it out. And I would think that he would look to Director OSTP to do it. But, you know, I hope he will look to someone. And you know, whatever you think of President Trump, I think we are in this kind of top-down situation where perhaps at the moment only the president can say, somebody, you know, sort this out.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, Alejandro is not on Fox and Friends.
Well, and the point that, you know, I think John is making is, you know, given the appointments, especially appointments that have anything to do with science or the environment, that have been made with this administration, there's not much hope, even if he were to identify somebody, who that person would be. Although, who knows? I guess we can hope for the best. If that were even to happen.
Yeah, I mean, the point is that even if we're pessimistic, it doesn't mean that people shouldn't try. And I'm sure that the Times, having broken this story, and in many ways broken something of a taboo, aren't just going to sit back and forget about this. And so, one of the important things to do now is we can all sort of sit around and be pleased about this and say, well, it's great that this subject has got some serious media attention. But one of the things that it seems to me now is what are the unanswered questions, or what questions haven't we asked yet that we should be asking? And how do we then, how do we move this forward? How do we capitalize on this?
Well, I think that's a good point. And if we get back to reality and how, these people are motivated, it's by politics. And I think that's been an interesting aspect. And I'd like to get both of your comments, because I know you pay attention to this sort of stuff. It's been a weird issue, UFOs, when you get into politics. Hillary kind of picked it up with her campaign, strangely, seemingly influenced by John Podesta, her campaign manager, who's into this, and has even had conversations with at least Tom DeLonge and maybe others in this organization, the TTSA, that they created. But right now, Harry Reid is kind of the point political guy in this, even though he did have bipartisan support to create this Department of Defense initiative. And it seems like the White House hasn't figured out, even from the campaign, I don't think Trump has figured out which side he wants to come down on the whole UFO issue. Does he want to... He never wants to agree with Hillary, but at the same time, I think Hillary was trying to speak to his base by even bringing up the UFO issue, and he doesn't want to displease his base either. So he hasn't said anything, and I wonder if you all have some thoughts on that.
Well, I think politically this is in the noise level. One of the things I've mentioned unpopularly at the conferences there is this is not a voting issue. There is a small group of people who are intensely interested. You have a large group of people who believe, but it is not something that's going to move politically. I don't think it is fair to say that there was bipartisan effort, because that infers that the parties themselves have taken positions, or numbers of them. What he did get was a number of people. I was a bit surprised. George Knapp had a very interesting program last night, and they started talking about Senator Stevens, who had a personal experience, so he was willing to go along with it because he had actually seen and encountered a UFO as a former Air Force pilot. But that's a big leap from there to, joint bipartisan agreement on it.
I guess it was...
I think it's a political nightmare. Huh?
I guess just meaning that Stevens at least was Republican. It wasn't just all Democrat or Republican.
Right. Well, no, it's not it. But I would say more than bipartisan, which infers party relationships, a lot of it is personality dependent. And there you have somebody, as I said, with Stevens, who had a personal encounter. Now, one of the things Senator Reid talked about, though, was that he also took blowback from people who said, this is satanic, we should not have anything to do with it, bringing it into an illogical religious argument as well. So they're all over the spectrum, and I think it's more personality, belief systems than it would be alignment with any party affiliation.
Nick, do you have some thoughts?
Not much on that, frankly. I mean, I think it's a classic case of UFOs should not be a political issue, but almost everything becomes a political issue.
Exactly.
So it's tricky.
Yeah, and that's the hard part. If everything becomes a political issue, so it either, if the White House is going to even do anything, they would want to justify it, and of course, then the Democrats would it would attack them. But I guess in the positive side, Democrats wouldn't really be as motivated to attack him on this issue if he did something on it, because their candidate and their people have been the recent people to be pushing this forward, even though in history we do have some big names in the Republican Party who have been big on this issue. Goldwater, somewhat Reagan, but for some others.
But remember, you have Jimmy Carter, obviously a Democrat, who had a personal observation. And it was interesting because there's his story is out on it, because he did ask officially, I forget which of the organization, but I think it was the Office of Science and Technology, to look at it. And they
NASA.
Basically told him to pack sand.
Yeah, it was NASA, and the Air Force advised NASA, don't do it. But I want to ask this question before we run out of time of each of you, and I guess we'll start with Nick. Is this news, this revelation of this organization in the DoD, a big deal? And if so, how much of a big deal?
It is a big deal. In one sense, it shouldn't surprise anyone that government looks at this, and I'd be frankly concerned if pilots are seeing things and things are being tracked on radar and somebody isn't looking at it. That would be a scandal. So it's a big deal. Clearly, the Times, as a paper of record, is very important here. We wait to see where we go. I think the next week or so it's going to be very interesting. And there are still some important unanswered questions. The references, for example, to recovered materials. What materials are those? Where are they currently stored? What tests were done on them? And what conclusions, if any, were found? So plenty of issues and plenty of unanswered questions still.
Right. And actually, there has been some positive movement in that. For instance, Robert Powell, he's part of the Scientific Coalition of Ufology, and he's a researcher for a while. He's been investigating that Nimitz case, and he's been told to pack sand with his FOIA requests. But now that this has been released, he went back to them and say, hey, wait a second. And they said, okay, we're going to be releasing some information soon. So we do have some more. They're actually going to respond to some of these FOIA requests on this Nimitz sighting. But, John, your thoughts on, is this a big deal?
Well, I guess I'd respectfully disagree with how big a deal it is. It is certainly interesting. One of my points is that if you look at what we did versus what they do now, they have better sensors. There's no doubt about that. They have collected more data. But I don't think they have any better answers. And you've got to remember that this is a phenomena that transcends basically time and space. It has been going on for millennia. I suspect in the long run it's going to be a hiccup. Who knows? Maybe they can, generate some interest. Now, one of Tom DeLonge's areas of interest, aside from the technology aspects, is to get younger folks more actively involved and, interested in exploring these topics. That would be a plus because, face it, if you look at the folks there and a lot of us, we're talking about dinosaurs. We need a lot of young folks that have the technical expertise to come up behind us and carry the torch forward.
Well, one of the things they mentioned is that Bigelow, and you would have more insight than the rest of us since you've been very close with Bigelow and you're in Nevada, that Bigelow has some sort of mysterious metal from a UFO. It's been kind of implied. Would that be a big deal if they have some metal?
It may or it may not be. I have argued that looking for unobtainium is probably not the right way to go. I hate to say it, in the area I agree with Sagan. And if you look at contact, how did they make it? It was by transferring information and using the materials that were available at the destination. Back when we were at when NIDS was still in existence, we did have some pieces and had it analyzed. but I never saw anything that indicated, again, it was unobtainium or something that was totally unexplained. We have had this sort of material reported for many decades. If they have something, and we have not seen the reports, obviously, that says it is totally new and we don't know how to do it, then that would be of interest. Some of the proponents for Roswell and other things suggest that maybe these are being intentionally left for us. That it's not accidental, and it's here for us to research and try to make steps forward in metallurgy or other material science.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're pretty much out of time. That time went so quickly, speaking of space-time anomalies. But I'll give you both 10 seconds. Yeah, of course, that's very little time to say anything. But if you had one final remark, Nick, what would that be?
It would be to keep an eye on this story as it develops over the next few weeks. There's more to come.
Mm-hmm. John?
I certainly agree with that, and we're hoping that some of these reports get released to the public where they should be.
Right. So, and I think we will be seeing more. So thank you guys so much for joining us, and we'll be talking to you soon, I'm sure.
Thank you.
Thank you much.
All right. Thanks, guys. I will probably get this up tomorrow, and I'll send you guys the links, and then it'll be on KGRA on Monday night. So thank you so much. I knew it would be interesting.
Well, if I don't speak to you all before, happy Christmas.
Yes, happy Christmas.
Happy Christmas. It's Merry Christmas. If you say happy holidays, then you're capitulating.
Well, you see, even that's political now.
I know everything.
That's crazy.
Even Santa Claus is political. Well, Merry Holidays.
Yeah. Well, like I said, we didn't get into it, but we used to say, from the intelligence standpoint, that if you said good morning, you could classify it because good modified the morning and offered information about how it was going.
That's pretty funny. Thank you so much to Nick Pope and to John Alexander. I think besides the primary people involved, they're the absolute best people to talk to. You can find information about both of them at their websites. John's website is johnbalexander.com, and Nick Pope's, I believe, is nickpope.net. But if you just Google Nick Pope, you'll find him all over the place. So check that out. Thanks, guys. Thank you to Martin for joining us at the beginning of the show. And I do want to wish everybody some happy holidays, including Caleb Hanks. Thank you for doing the opening and close music. Systematics, who does the bumper music. And be sure to go register for the UFO Congress, ufocongress.com right now. Above all times, it's important to get there so we can have these conversations. And no doubt everybody's going to be sharing some interesting takes on this recent news. And we'll have some more to share about guests related to this very important news. Anyway, you all have a wonderful holiday weekend. Until next time, adios, muchachos.